Thank you very much, Brian and Alison, for the invitation and for your help with sorting this out. As Brian has said, how did I know Peter? Well, I was a postdoc with him working on an MRC grant on crossover trials in Oxford from 84 to 87. And then I collaborated with Peter and Geoffrey Berry on the 4th edition of his book, Statistical Methods in Medical Research. That was more towards the end of the 90s and early 2000s. I've been asked to really just give a few personal reminiscences about Peter, which will be the first part of the talk, and then my own views of Peter's contributions to our subject in general. And I'll make a number of points in that second part, which I think will be picked up by speakers later in the day. So, first contact with Peter. Well, in 80 to 81 academic year, I was doing the diploma in mathematical statistics at this university. And my dissertation was supervised by Ian Sutherland, who was then the director of the MRC Biostatistics Unit, as it was then called, but only just then called. And the unit had moved from London to the Hills Road site in Cambridge and changed its name, but not its nature, from the Statistical Services and Research Unit to the Biostatistics Unit. Now, the diploma course was a slightly strange course in many ways. Many diploma courses are sort of MSc light, where you do the exams, but you don't proceed to the summer dissertation. The diploma was quite a venerable course, allegedly the oldest postgraduate taught course in statistics anywhere. And it had a dissertation, but one that you had to hand in 3 weeks before you did your exams. So you really needed to get cracking with doing the course, doing your dissertation. So bright and early in the academic year, I got back to Cambridge, and I found out that, because I'd been told that this unit was moving and that Pat Altham would try and get me supervised by somebody in the unit, and indeed I was supervised by the director. So I went down. It was somewhere on the Hills Road site. I had hardly been to the Hills Road site. In fact, I'd never been to the Hills Road site before. So I got on a bus and went miles south, and I pitched up, and I eventually found the premises for the Biostatistics Unit. And I got in there, and it was full of boxes, box after box after box. And I wandered around, and postcards. This was 1980, remember, no email to speak of, really, and no web or anything like that. So the postcards around, and a door which said Ian Sutherland, director, on it, and it was open, and there was nobody inside it. And there was another room next to it, which was for his assistant, I presumed, and that was open, and nobody was inside it. So, equipped with the social sophistication that comes from 3 years on the maths tripos, I froze, and there was a pile of postcards which said the MRC Statistical Services and Research Unit is moving from Gower Street to Cambridge and changing its name but not its nature. So as you can tell, I mean, I read those cards so often that after all this time, I still remember that phrase. Anyway, there were a couple of people who came walking in, and I didn't know them, but I think I later recognized them as people I was to get to know rather better. And I suspect it was their first morning in the unit in Cambridge. Anyway, a little bit later, Ian turned up, and he was very, very charming, and managed to hide the fact that the last thing he wanted to see at that moment was an eager young diploma student wanting supervision. And he sent me away and advised me to read Bradford Hill on Principles and Armitage on Methods. And I say, I'd been on the maths tripos, and as such, I was partial to a good formula. And I found Bradford Hill rather meagre pickings. I came to appreciate the book only rather later. But Armitage, now there was a man I could relate to, and so that was probably my first proper introduction. It wasn't Peter in person, it was Peter in print. So the diploma came and went, and from 81 to 84, I was a PhD student at the School of Hygiene. I was supervised by Michael Healy, who was Peter's immediate successor in the chair at the school. And then I applied for a postdoc position in what was then the Department of Biomathematics at Oxford, working with, as I said, with Peter on there. It's not really for me to judge. Says I'm Professor of Statistics. I'm Emeritus Professor. I've thrown in the towel now, from this point of view. And I look back at my career, it's not really for me to judge, but I look back at that career, it's probably all right. But if you adjust for who my mentors were, the adjusted mean changes from all right to barely adequate. Anyway, so I went and I was interviewed by Peter and the late John Bithell in the Pusey Street offices of what was then the Department of Biomathematics. And I never worked there. By the time I took up my post in June, they'd moved to a lovely house in South Berks Road. So I was into it. This was my first job interview. And my friends had sort of said, what questions are you going to ask? They're going to ask me questions. They'll ask you questions at the end. They'll say, have you any questions first? And if you don't have any, you look a real numpty. So I had to think of a question. So I came up with this question at the end. So of course, Peter did say, is there anything you want to ask? And I said, is there a college association with this job? Oh, he said, what a good question. It wasn't, as I will reveal. I said, well, he said, oh, yeah. He said, what college were you at? I said, I was at Sydney, Sussex. He said, oh, that's the sister college of St. John's. He said, leave it with me, sort of thing. So I left the interview, stunned by the easy way in which these two Oxford dons were able to pair up Oxbridge colleges. And then I got the job. I started in June, and things proceeded through the summer. Then partway through the summer, I got this letter from Sir John Kendrew, who was president of St. John's College. John Kendrew. So I scuttered off to my copy of the double helix. And yes, indeed, there was a John Kendrew who got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, the same ceremony that Crick and Watson and Wilkins got theirs for physiology. Peter had written to a Nobel laureate for me. Oh my goodness, and he had written to me. Oh, good heavens, this is what Oxford was about. Oh, dear me. So, what about Oxford? Well, I got to know a few of the strange things about Oxford. You know, I was paid by the university chest after a while. And then I discovered other bits of Oxford nomenclature a little bit later. I heard about battles. Battles, if you haven't been involved with Oxford, they're a bill. And I got a bill from St. John's for £60 for my membership of the Middle Common Room. Well, I look back at my contract, I still have it. And that, over the year, would have been 3% of my gross salary. And I went to see them and said, well, what am I getting for this? And they said, well, you'll be able to have lunch in college and things like that. And I said, well, you'll get it for, no, you'll have to pay for lunch, but you can come in now. They said, even the president pays. I thought, well, I bet he goes to lunch. So I think I got away without writing to Sir John. I just wrote to somebody else and resigned my membership of St. John's College. But then I had to make my peace with Peter. And of course, he was charm itself and he was very understanding. And although the most generous of men, you know, he was from Huddersfield and would understand that, you know, there were plenty of his friends would have turned their brass over in their pockets at night, and 60 quid for something you weren't going to have was something to be. But he was very generous, and every summer he held a garden party in his house at Drayton, just south of Oxford. When I was there, I had a room at the top of South Parks Road. It wasn't really my room, it was a room for the academic visitor. And when I started, the academic visitor was Vern Farewell. And he'd had a splendid, probably 6 or 9 months in glorious isolation, and then this rather over-talkative postdoc landed on him to ruin the tail end of his sabbatical. But anyway, he was there at the garden party, and there were 2 small children running around with his. I've never written a paper with Vern, but I have written a paper with one of those children, which is a pleasure, if a slightly aging one. My other work with Peter was on the book Statistical Methods in Medical Research, particularly the 4th edition. Although my Google Scholar page, I never mentioned this to the authorities in Newcastle, but my Google Scholar page gives me quite a lot of citations for this book, but actually they're citations for all the editions of this book. So I do have some citations from just prior to my O-levels. But I've not mentioned that hitherto. Peter reorganized a lot of the teaching at the School of Hygiene when he was professor there. There were many courses for specialists and non-specialists. Notably, he instituted the MSc in Medical Statistics. And part of what happened with all these, indeed, some of the courses that he instituted, I demonstrated on when I was a PhD student, and they existed well beyond Peter's time at the school. And he put quite a bit of this work together in Statistical Methods in Medical Research. And that was published by Peter alone in 1971, and then by Peter and Geoffrey Berry in 87, and then a 3rd edition in 94, and by 3 of us in 2002. This is the only known picture of Armitage, Berry and Matthews. And it was October 99. I think it was when it was just starting to get difficult. I mean, none of us look in the remotest bit happy. But there you go. It's not easy writing books in modern. Okay. Enough of what I was involved with. Peter's first paper was published in 1946 in the supplement of the RSS journal, which became Series B. And his last paper was in 2024. In the period, I've split the period from up to 1960 into these 2 bits here, where he had 38 papers, quite a lot in statistics journals. A higher proportion would often be the case for a modern medical statistician. Stuff on sequential clinical trials. These were reports of our randomized trials, and then a whole collection of other papers. And actually quite relatively large number of 19 in this 2-year period here, including his book on sequential medical trials. And what happened with these papers, what might be seen as the highlights? Well, a lot of the early development for sequential trials went on during this period. A sort of one-off was the chi-square test for trend in 2/R tables, which was of great importance in these pre-logistic regression days, and appeared in biometrics. And then, as we'll hear later this morning, under the other, there were a couple of, at least a couple of papers with the then Richard Doll on a model for carcinogenesis. I split the, well, there were certain reasons why I split the time at 1960. But Peter went to the US in 57 and was at the National Cancer Institute and visited other institutions while he was there, including Berkeley, where Eric Lehman offered him a permanent post, because he said, we've got a very strong theoretical department here, but he wanted someone to lead the department. So it wasn't just any old post, it was leading the applied part of statistics. And then later in that year, he ended up at Johns Hopkins and was offered post of the chair of biostatistics. And this was just pitching up and, would you like a job? And he didn't take them. And there are two reasons which come out of this. The first is that I don't think he was that sure about moving to the States at that time for family reasons, but also he knew that Bradford Hill was likely to retire in the not too distant future, and he's written in his unpublished autobiography that he thought that they might well change that post from a chair to a readership, and he may have a chance of a readership. I'll just skip ahead. In 1961, in January, he visited Harvard School of Public Health, and they offered him a job. They offered him the post of chair of biostatistics. So I don't know what those papers had done for his reputation, but they'd obviously done quite a lot. Well, fortunately for British statistics, those attempts to seduce him over the Atlantic failed, and Bradford Hill did retire, and they didn't change it to a readership. They kept it as a chair, and Peter got it. And he was there until 1976. And in that period, he published 63 papers, 15 of them in statistics journals, 8 trial reports, reports of genuine trials. And although Peter was known for controlled trials, if you look at his list of publications, there were many contributions across epidemiology, quite a lot across assays, laboratory studies, some of which went back to the time when he was doing, well, he did his PhD through publication in London in about 1950 or so. And those had, quite a bit of that had been about laboratory studies, and there was some stuff about observer agreement. What are the key contributions in this period? Obviously, this is just my opinion, but I think the foundational papers on repeated significance testing in Series A of the journal, the first one with Clem McPherson and Beverly Rowe in 1969, when under the true null hypothesis, and then in 71, when H0 was false, with Clem. These were later developed by Stuart Pocock and Group Sequential Designs and many others, including Max Palmer. I pick out, there were many people who did distinguished work, but I pick out these two because Stuart's PhD was overseen by Peter, and Max did his DPhil with Peter at the same time that I was a postdoc in Oxford. And the other thing which has been celebrated quite a bit and was I lose exactly what anniversary it was. It may have been the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the MSc Medical Statistics, and then more recently, it's probably getting closer to its 60th now, which I think has been that course is still going strong and is one of the most well, the best MScs in medical statistics around even now. And he wrote, in amongst all this, he just managed to write that book as well. Anyway, after that period, he felt time for a change. Maurice Bartlett was due to retire from the chair of biomathematics at Oxford, and Peter applied for that. And he said he then sort of got a note saying, yes, we've been accepted. Please, would you sort of pitch up as professor? There was no, at that stage, Oxford generally didn't interview professors. They just thought about whether it'd be a good idea or not. And in this period, he published slightly fewer, because broadly similar period to the one that he'd had at the School of Hygiene. He published slightly fewer papers. There was a bigger emphasis on those in stats journals. There were only 4 trial reports at a time when there were more and more trial reports getting going. But his papers focused more on the general conduct of trials and methodological points about that. He did some other work, including some on crossover trials and some work on the epidemiology of rabies, which had its moment in I think the late 70s, early 80s. Maybe we were worried about something then. Key contributions in this period. By now, he was sort of moving towards sort of the eminence grise, really. He was a very senior figure in medicine and statistics. His advice and participation in many projects and on many committees was sought, not least on data monitoring committees, where he had he'd originally been the person that had sort of said, well, you stop a trial when you cross this boundary or when P is less than this. And I think he came to the conclusion that obviously why you stop a trial and how you do it depends on so many factors and so many variables that it's difficult to accommodate in an algorithmic fashion. And the role of the data monitoring committee was something he thought about quite deeply. He was also president of the RSS and ISCB, and having been IBS president while he was still in London. He managed the second edition of his book with Geoffrey, and he was quite clear. He was in the Department of Biomathematics. He was professor of biomathematics, but there was always a problem in Oxford of statistics being very dispersed. And he spotted this all was going on while I was a postdoc, but it was not something obviously I was privy to in the slightest, but I could tell what was going on with various people trailing into the department. And it was quite an auspicious time for statistics. Sir Klaus Moser, who just stepped down as the chief statistician, was the warden at Wadham College. David Cox was about to become warden at Nuffield. I think there was a certain amount of political heft behind the idea of establishing a Department of Statistics, and that's what Peter oversaw and became its first head. And that department has gone on from strength to strength. He retired in 1990, and he was pushed into delaying his retirement because he was chair of an important faculty committee. And as Peter is so accommodating, he did go ahead with that. So when he did retire, he probably had the more than usual relief from that side of things. He undertook two major publishing activities in retirement. He did two further editions of SMMR, a third edition of Geoffrey in the mid-90s, and then the one we did together in 2002. He also published this multi-volume Encyclopedia of Biostatistics by Wiley, which he edited with Ted Colton in 1998, with the second edition coming out in 2005. Verne has found some information on publications during his retirement. The lack of a definitive list, at least one that we have to find, fits badly with one's expectations of Peter's assiduity, but well with his notions of modesty. He probably just wouldn't have been too bothered about it. From what we have gathered, he had about 50 articles. About half of them were various sort of articles within the encyclopedia. There were many historical reviews. He gave many talks of that kind that I remember attending, and the papers are often tributes to colleagues. He also had one, Should We Cross Off the Crossover, which was the only paper he wrote on crossovers after my postdoc. Perhaps the easiest theme to discern is with approaches to interim analyses and stopping trials. And Peter took an increasingly broad perspective, and we may hear a bit more about that later in the day. So, Peter, he was clearly a researcher and a teacher of the first rank. You don't pitch up at Harvard and have a few chats and then get off with the headship of department if you're not of the first rank. He was an academic colleague of enormous reliability, empathy, and shrewdness. As a mentor, you might have thought that he had prepared me for academic life in a way that few others could. And in some respects, that was true. But he did let me down. the business about St. John's College, I mean, when Peter said he would do something, he did it. So I left Oxford thinking that senior professors were like that. So that was something of a letdown. It took me many years to work out what was going on. I kept waiting for them to do something. His human qualities shone through. The picture at the beginning was the picture that was preceded his presidential address in Series A of JRSS. And it does have a very austere quality to it. But he was a very humorous man. I remember, I think it was at short notice that one of the presidents, past presidents of the RSS had pulled out, and he seconded the vote of thanks to Sir John Kingman, who, at his presidential address, and he said that he'd hoped that Sir John's vice-chancelloriate duties at Bristol had not impeded his very active presidency. He also alighted on Ewan Page, who was about to step down as treasurer, who was vice-chancellor at Reading, and remarked that it was in our five offices to have a vice-chancellor was remarkable enough, but to have two was beginning to look like carelessness. I call this lecture some innovator, mentor, friend, gentleman, leader. It put me a bit in mind of that sketch. You know, our main weapon is surprise and fear. Our two main weapons are surprise and fear and Ruth. I talked about many things with Peter, but I never got on to Monty Python. And yet at his funeral, his daughter Ruth said she remembers him falling off his chair laughing at Peter Cook. It was, we don't know our colleagues the way their families do, as we all know. But he was a man of great warmth. He was utterly without rancour. He was somebody that could be called on and often was called upon to give any issue or controversy a fair hearing and exposition. And knowing Peter was a privilege many of us treasure, and both as a colleague, but also as a friend.